Cross Question here on LBC. You can phone 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel. You can text 84850, send a comment to LBC if you want to use Alexa, and do watch us on Global Player. With me tonight in the studio we have Heidi Alexander, Labour candidate for Swindon South at the next election. She's former Shadow Health Secretary and Deputy Mayor of London. Ben Habib is a businessman and he's also intending to run at the next election for Reform UK. Robert Shrimsley is Chief Political Commentator for and Executive Editor of the Financial Times. And Amy Hart is an influencer, TV personality and former Love Island contestant, but far more importantly, an addict of the For the Many podcast. They're here to answer your questions. 0345 6060 973.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Now, you can ask about anything you like, but you might want to ask about these new oil and gas licences that Rishi Sunak has announced today. You might want to call in about motorists, because Rishi Sunak says he's on the side of motorists as he launches a review into schemes like low traffic neighbourhoods. And what about this British man in jail for 2 years in Cyprus for killing his seriously ill wife, but he's been released because he's already served his sentence while awaiting trial. And a prize for the person who can think of our final fun text question and make it about Australia. I can't think why I should say that today of all days, but do your best. Right, let's go to our first question. It's from Stephen in East Grinstead. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, good evening, Ian. Good evening,
Hi.
panel. The Prime Minister is reported to be on the side of motorists. So why, when Chancellor, did he and the then Transport Minister, Grant Shapps, turn a blind eye to pump price manipulation by forecourt fuel suppliers? And I'd just like to point out that Grant Shapps is now the Energy Security and Net Zero Minister.
Just explain what you say. They've turned a blind eye to price pump manipulation. I mean, I can understand what that means, but just explain in your own words what you're accusing them of.
Well, it was reported in various papers over the years that wholesale prices went down, but forecourt fuel suppliers were not passing on the decrease in the fuel prices. So forecourts have been charging their customers more.
And what do you think they should have done about it?
Well, I think they should have been honest and put their prices down nearer to the wholesale prices.
No, but what should the government have done about it?
I think they should have asked the forecourt fuel suppliers to pass on the decreases as much as they could.
Well, let's widen this out as well, because I mean that's quite a specific question, but obviously I want our panel to answer that. But there is an accusation going around at the moment that there is a war on the motorist. You've got the ULEZ scheme, you've got local traffic networks, all sorts of other things that seem to be... I mean, I was in Norwich at the weekend, and I mean... They're obviously trying to get all cars out of Norwich city centre. Yes, I know I'm sounding like Alan Partridge. But, I mean, it's impossible. For somebody who went to university there, you cannot find your way around Norwich because all the streets you want to go down are shut. Is there a war on the motorist too? Ben Habib.
I think there is absolutely a war on the motorist. I mean, if you look at all the, new regulations that have been foisted on the motorist, but starting at the petrol pump, 48% of what you pay to fill your car up goes straight to the government. You drive your car out, you're not allowed to go more than 20 miles an hour. You want to come into central London, you've got to pay a congestion charge, £15, up from £11 before. You've got low traffic neighbourhoods, so you can't use the roads for which you're paying road tax, ever increasing road tax. And now we've got ULEZ being expanded, and we've got 15-minute cities coming in. And this...
Sorry, that's a new one on me. What's that?
15-minute cities. Have you not followed 15-minute cities? Oh, my goodness. This is like all the rage and in the debates
Do
that I see.
Do we all know what a 15-minute city is? Yeah.
Unfortunately. I've seen a bit on Facebook.
Oh, I feel so ignorant now.
Yeah, so, I mean, it started in Oxford, I think. It was Oxford Borough that promoted this to start with, but there are a number of other boroughs looking at it, where you have everything you need within 15 minutes of a locality, and you're not allowed to cross over into any other locality with an internal combustion engine supporting your mode of travel.
That's nonsense.
That's not quite true, Ben. You're not allowed to use certain roads to cross over.
Okay, more than 100 times a year or something. Have I got that right, Robert?
Don't remember
No,
that bit.
that's complete rubbish.
Well,
it is. What you're talking about, Ben, I think, is
I don't think it's complete rubbish. There is a restriction on how you travel out of your 15-minute area.
That's right. You have to use ring roads to get around.
So you've got to go out, come round, and go back in.
I have heard of this.
Yeah, but the whole idea is a sort of principle in which you have the things that you need within 15 minutes walking or cycling of your home. So supermarkets, doctors' surgeries, a town centre, leisure facilities, and then you try and plan the road network. This isn't about containing people.
Well, that's precisely what it is, isn't it? It's containing people.
It's about giving people choice, Ben.
It's not giving. No, it's restricting your ability to get around your own neighbourhood, as it is with LTNs, as it is with 20 mile an hour speed limits.
Low traffic neighbourhoods are principally about addressing rat running in an area. So if you look at the volume of traffic on residential roads in London, it has increased exponentially over the last decade because of the widespread use of sat-navs.
Are you sure exponential isn't a superlative to evidence your position?
It has increased very significantly.
Okay.
And if you actually look at the number of people who are killed and seriously injured on residential roads in London, not main roads, it's actually disproportionately happening on those roads.
Let's come back to these issues in a second, but let's answer Stephen's question first about price manipulation on the forecourt of petrol pumps.
Well, I'm not aware of that specific allegation, but I do concur with you that, or your question, I answer your question in the affirmative, that there is a war on the motorist, and it wouldn't surprise me if motor pumps were making more money than...
Okay, Robert.
Would have expected.
Well, I mean, I think what is true is that oil groups were not always as quick to pass on decreases in the wholesale price as they were to pass on increases. I think that's what...
banks and interest rates to say
well, is that referring to? But I think in terms of this war on the motorist, it's one of those classic situations where we're allowing, hyperbole and exaggeration to cloud the issue. What is true is that unquestionably there are more restrictions on motorists than there were 50 years ago about where you can drive, about what you can do. A lot of these, particularly in city centres, this isn't a national thing, but it's particularly something that happens in the centre of major cities, partly because they have better public transport networks, partly because there's a desire to pedestrianise and improve cycling, and that some of these unquestionably make life harder if you want to drive around. This is a fact. Each of these individual policies has a rationale which you can justify. The 20 mile an hour speed limit is because you have much less chance of killing someone if you hit them at 20 miles an hour than if you do at 30 miles an hour.
If you stop driving altogether, you won't kill anyone with a car.
Exactly.
But that's a reduction to absurdity, Ben. Surely you don't believe that people should be allowed to drive down residential roads with a school in at 100 miles an hour, do you?
No.
Well, OK, so you believe in speed restrictions. We're all
so it's a matter of where the pendulum...
I would suggest that the speed restriction should be at the level where it doesn't kill people.
Can we just establish right from now that we're not going to talk over each other, because people at home cannot make out who's saying something, and they might think that, Robert, you're talking something, that you're expressing a view that actually Ben is, and you wouldn't want that, would you?
Well, the thing is, I think the point is, some of the things Ben said are correct. It's just a question of how you choose to frame this. There isn't a war on the motorist, but there is a desire to limit some of the freedoms that motorists enjoyed, as I said, 20 or 30 years ago. So the truth is, if you're Jeremy Clarkson, that feels deeply unfair. But if you're worried about air pollution in your road, or rat runs, or the safety of your children as they cross the road, some of these seem reasonable. And the truth is, what we're going into is a stage of recalibrating the rights of motorists against the rights of other people. Now, have they gone too far? Some people think yes, some people think no. But it's not exactly Sniper Alley in Sarajevo. Some of this is overdoing it.
And the pump price issue?
Well, as I said, I think that the issue was that the reductions weren't being passed on as quickly as the increases, and that's capitalism for you.
Amy?
I think there has been a war on the motorists. A lot of my family live up in Hertfordshire and in Brentwood and stuff, so they've been really hit by this new ULEZ sort of expansion. And for some of them, they're having to change cars, and luckily they're able to do it. But there's going to be a lot of people that can't do it, and again, it's going to be the people who are sort of living below the poverty line that are being hit again. But I do think that these LTNs and stuff, I was reading today that nobody's ever campaigned against it once they've been put in. So they're all a bit scared about it at the beginning, but then once they've gone in, nobody's campaigned against it.
Is that right, Heidi? Because, of course, you were presumably behind introducing a lot of these when you were Deputy Mayor of London.
So one of the really interesting things in your caller's question was him asking, was Rishi Sunak turning a blind eye to the fact that there was price manipulation at the petrol pumps? And I think some of Robert's comments were very sensible on that. What people perhaps don't know is that when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor and Boris Johnson was Prime Minister and Grant Shapps was Transport Secretary, they announced ring-fence pots of money to introduce low-traffic neighbourhoods. They were Rishi Sunak's policy, they were Grant Shapps' policy, and in fact in the TfL funding agreement that were negotiated during COVID, there were requirements upon Transport for London to introduce them, and the then Transport Advisor to the Prime Minister, Andrew Gilligan, used to come in to Transport for London when the office was empty with a map of where exactly he wanted to put bollards on streets in London, and that's not an exaggeration, that's completely the truth. And so
bollards were being introduced by Number 10. I mean, how local is that?
Well, this would be my point about this announcement about the review of low-traffic neighbourhoods. We're in a total mess as a country. People haven't seen a proper pay rise in a decade. People are worried about getting an NHS dentist. They're worried about whether they can afford their weekly food shop. And you've got the Prime Minister banging on about 20 mile per hour zones and speed humps. And I just think, God, get with the reality of life in the UK today, because this really isn't people's priority. And so I think it's pretty...
Them?
No, I'm in favour of low traffic neighbourhoods. What I think is pointless and a bit pathetic and a bit hypocritical on the part of Rishi Sunak is 2 years, 3 years down the line from when he was promoting low traffic neighbourhoods as government policy, he's now saying there's a war on the motorist and let's review them. I also think this language about a war on the motorist is extreme. You know, talk to people that are being bombed out of their home in Kiev about.
But that's not an apt comparison, Heidi.
Ben,
you don't have to go from London to Kiev to evidence your point.
People are talking about a war on the motorist. Yeah. There is a war that's raging in Ukraine at the moment, and talk to anyone there and they won't talk to you about 20 mile per hour zones.
If that is your hurdle for judging government policy,
there is not a war on the motorist.
If that is your hurdle for judging government policy, you would usher through all policies that either your party or the incumbent government would wish to bring in. There'd be no debate, because you'd be able to say, well, there's a war in Ukraine, so that's much more serious than anything else we wish to do.
I'm just saying,
it's just a completely inappropriate comparison.
I don't think we need to use more moderate language.
Well, you've just gone to the extreme, Heidi.
I do remind people.
Enough. Robert.
I just at one point I think that's interesting about the argument on low traffic networks and indeed on the ULEZ is you can oppose these policies or you can support them. It's perfectly rational to take either position. But one thing I think that's interesting is that both of these are policies that have been pushed by democratically elected organisations, democratically elected local councils and democratically elected mayors. And I think one thing that does trouble me, particularly in a government which often talks the talk of decentralisation and putting powers back in the hands of people, is that it doesn't necessarily walk the walk when they do something that it doesn't like. Now, as I said, you can oppose these policies, but you can't say they don't have some kind of democratic mandate.
Amy.
I was just going to say, I forgot to say it last time, I've been listening to a lot of things today and people are saying, don't drive, use the bus, use your legs, walk, cycle. But when people's kids are being placed in schools that are way out of catchment area, and when, my grandparents are on the phone about hospital appointments, they're saying, well, it's 25-week wait at your local hospital, but if you can get to this one that's an hour and 15 minutes away, it's then a 10-week wait. So it's like, can they walk there? No, they can't. So, it's very well and good telling people...
You live in a rural area, don't you?
Sort of. We live in Worthing, so next to Brighton. So sort of rural. It's not quite London.
So I think Amy makes a fair point there, and I think my position on all of this is that as a society we need to try and reduce our dependency on the car. Will there be trips that people need to do which require a car? Of course there will be. But would we have better towns and cities and a better quality of life if we didn't have congested roads, if we had cleaner air, if people felt confident to walk and cycle and there were more things in their local neighbourhood which they could reach within 15 minutes? That sounds like a pretty good deal to me.
Right, well, that was quite a feisty opening, wasn't it? Let's see where we get to on our next question, which we will come to in just a few moments' time. Keep your calls coming, though, 0345 6060 973. You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:15.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:17. We have had one suggestion on Alexa for our Australian question at the end, which is this. But basically, I'm reading this out because the challenge is to better it. About Australia, who do you prefer? Neighbours, home and away, or prisoner cell block H? Can you do better than that for our question at the end? If you can, 84850. I think it's quite easy to do better than that one, frankly, but thank you to Simon who sent it in. Right, let me reintroduce our guest. Heidi Alexander is here, Labour politician, Ben Habib from Reform UK, Amy Hart, who is not a politician, but I think you'd quite like to be, wouldn't you?
One day, yeah.
One day, but possibly not just yet. And Robert Shrimsley, who's never wanted to be a politician, I'm assuming.
No,
Chief political commentator and executive editor of The Find. What does an executive editor actually do?
They edit executively.
I knew you were going to say that. You're too predictable. Robbie is in Chelmsford. Robbie, hello. What would you like to say?
Evening all. Trying to cut through all the discussions and debates about what type of energies we use, wouldn't the most efficient long-term investment be in energy to insulate our homes and reduce the waste?
Amy?
Yes, completely agree. I live in a new build house, so I very rarely have to put my heating on. I think insulation is brilliant, whereas my mum and dad's house is horrendous to heat, but they don't have a choice to heat it. I think waste as well. I buy so much stuff. I am the worst one for it. I'm trying to better myself. I am trying to repurpose my clothes, trying to buy secondhand, but we are such a wasteful society. And I think with things like Amazon and now like Temu, which is the new Amazon, it's going to kill Amazon. Yeah, Temu. Mm-hmm. Everything is so easy to get, and like at one point we're having 3 Amazon deliveries a day. So yes, waste is a big issue, and I need to better myself, and I think other people should too.
But in terms of insulation, I mean, I think everyone can agree it's good to have an insulated home. I mean, there are older homes that you just can't insulate because the building doesn't allow it. But isn't it up to individuals to take that step? I mean, everybody looks to governments to provide grants for insulation, but isn't it in the end down to individuals?
Yeah, I think so. And also, it's your heating bill, isn't it? So if you want is speculate to accumulate. So if you want to bring your heating bills down, potentially trying to set aside some money. But obviously for a lot of people, that's not a possibility.
Because it will cost several £1,000s to insulate a home, probably depending on its size, I guess, and the complexity of it, which most people don't have several £1,000s lying around to do that. Robert?
Well, obviously, more insulation is a good thing, and government will have a role in this, although a lot of the cost will fall on the individuals, just as government will have a role as and when we have to come to replacing domestic boilers, which is, is going to make the row over cars look like a small squabble. But I think in terms of the energy mix, what you have to say is that government has been, I think, very poor in addressing concerns that have been around for a very long time. We've been having the same argument at nuclear power stations for an extraordinarily long time. We're not building them. The government has been talking about wanting new nuclear build for well over a decade. It hasn't happened. They halted onshore wind. Some of the things we might come on to the issue of oil and gas licenses, but in the long-term future, these are the energies, the energies that we know work, energy sources that we know work, and which can do more for the country. And I think, whatever you think of the specific arguments about oil at the moment, government has to get on with providing other sources of energy which are reliable, and that has to mean renewables and nuclear.
Heidi?
Look, I totally agree with your caller that the first thing that we have to do is sort out home insulation. We're doing 10 times less energy efficiency measures under this government than we were doing at the end of the last Labour government. My party, the Labour Party, has put forward the Green Prosperity Plan. We've talked about upgrading the insulation in 19 million homes. Those are the worst insulated homes in the country. One of the ways in which we are considering doing it is sort of an area-based scheme where we would provide some public subsidy to families who are on low incomes and don't have the money in order to do that. But if you were doing it area by area, then people who live in that area could then also be part of the scheme, pay into it, but then get a good deal because you've got an efficiencies of scale there. And so I think before, we talk a lot, don't we, about how we generate our energy, where it's coming from. That's big in the news today. But your caller's absolutely right that home insulation has to be sorted out as well.
Ben?
Well, I rather agree with you, Ian. I mean, I think it's down to the individual. It costs a lot of money. We're in the cost of living crisis at the moment. A few £1,000s per head is a lot of money. Government spending is already completely out of control. We've got national debt at post-World War II high. We've got taxes at a post-World War II high. Where's the money going to come from? It's a massive amount of money, by the way. I've read varying estimates between £5 billion to £10 billion to get this done to the level that Heidi and perhaps her colleagues would like to have it done. I think Amy made some very good points. Reduce, recycle, reuse. And those are the three words my parents used to tell me when I was a child, well before global warming, or global boiling as it's now called, was an issue.
But according to Tony Blair, or I should say Sir Tony Blair now, he's saying, well, it doesn't really matter what we do as individuals in our country. It won't make the slightest bit of difference, which I thought was a strange message for him to be promulgating.
Well, it's a very strange message from Tony Blair, considering that he set in motion a lot of the constraints which the economy is now having to keep up with as far as environmental, social and corporate governance issues and so on are concerned, and the heavy duty and cost that goes with them. But, we've got to remember that there's an election next year, and Tony Blair is no doubt giving the Labour Party an assisting hand in getting them to appear to be slightly less left-leaning than they, are in reality. And I think that's why Tony Blair says what he says. But he does nevertheless make a valid point. The United Kingdom produces less than 1% of global emissions. We have, of course, offshored a lot of our global emissions to China, which we don't count as part of our own production, because now we get China to do the dirty work for us, such as, for example, producing the wind turbines that everyone wants to put onshore and offshore and everywhere else. They're produced in China. So, I think, I personally think the whole net zero agenda needs to be wound back. We need to take the pressure off the car user, including banning internal combustion engines in 2030. I think we've actually got to make it easier for homeowners to own homes. And remember, a lot of these buildings, as you rightly said, Ian, were built a long time ago. People can't afford it. It's a big on cost.
OK. Let's widen this out a bit, because we were talking the last hour about the decision to allow more than 100 new production licences for North Sea oil and gas. Should that be the government's priority, Robert?
I think, although I don't personally think it's a good idea, I understand the argument on this, but what troubles me more is that if you're going to make the argument that we don't really need to hit our 2050 targets till 2050, it's not an intermediate process, we can get there at the very end, and we have to use what oil and gas reserves we have as a transitional fuel now, then you have to have a coherent strategy for what you're transitioning to. And as I was saying a few minutes ago, I think the problem is we're not seeing the alternative energy sources being brought on stream. We're not seeing nuclear development. We're not seeing a further expansion in renewables. The carbon capture and storage idea that Rishi Sunak also outlined today is still a relatively unproven technology, and there are substantial questions about it. People talk about hydrogen, also unproven and possibly expensive. So the difficulty I have with what Rishi Sunak's done is that I don't think it's part of a cogent energy strategy, and I don't think it actually delivers long-term energy security or cheaper prices, because actually the best way to get yourself out of the pocket of oil-producing nations is to get out of being an oil-dependent economy.
But all the studies suggest that even in 2050, 25% of our energy needs will still be provided by oil and gas. So, Heidi, when Labour say, well, we wouldn't allow any new licences, but we'll let the existing ones run, isn't that illogical?
I don't think so, because my understanding is that there are a number of licences that have already been issued where the companies are waiting to take a decision on whether to produce using those licences. So there is actually still scope within those reserves that have already been licensed. And I think it's right that we draw a line in the sand now and say that in future our energy needs to be coming from renewables, from onshore, offshore wind, from solar.
But isn't this the mistake that's been made in the past, where you're putting all your eggs in the renewable basket? Isn't it from an energy security point of view, shouldn't we still have a bit of oil and gas, a bit of nuclear?
There will be. Because,
so
as
why
I've
not
said,
allow these licences then?
Because actually what we need to do is set the investment framework now and send a clear signal about what our policy is going to be going forward so that investors have certainty. And when you think about how long it takes to build infrastructure in this country, I was heavily involved with the construction of the Elizabeth line in London. It took the best part.
I still haven't been on.
It's absolutely fantastic.
Everyone tells me it is.
Best part of 15 years. To build that. We're talking about changing wholesale our energy infrastructure in this country. We can't wait. The Office for Budget Responsibility has said that if you delay a decade, it will double in cost.
But Heidi, what we've done...
And so I think, for Ben to say he thinks we should be rolling back on net zero, totally the wrong thing to be saying. The last 3 weeks of this month has been the hottest 3 weeks on record. We've had the hottest 3 days. These are global temperatures.
Not even in Rhodes it hasn't been.
No.
Or Corfu, for that matter.
Well, if you read the press release that came out today by the global experts on this...
Guterres, who thinks it's global boiling now.
Well, you can interrupt me as much as you want, Ben, but the fact of the matter is we've had the hottest 3 weeks on record. We've had the hottest 3 days ever. Ocean temperatures at this time of year are at the hottest they have ever been. You can smile and laugh about it. I don't think it's a laughing matter, to be honest. And I think the longer we delay, it's going to be future generations that are paying the price for this.
Amy?
I actually think that the whole North Sea oil thing today is Rishi Sunak trying to clutch at straws, trying to get more votes. He's saying that everyone's absolutely at their wits' end with Just Stop Oil. And he's like, that's something I can target, like the ULEZ thing in Uxbridge.
We have a swear box on this programme. Every time you mention them, you have to put £1 in.
Okay.
Ben?
Well, I just want to say one thing. The US has the biggest spending programme on what it calls the climate crisis, $370 billion. There's nothing like it globally. But what the US has done, in stark contrast to the United Kingdom, is actually champion fossil fuels first. They've become a fracking, self-independent, exporting producer of gas and oil. They have total energy security. So as they make the transition to their form of net zero, the climate crisis as they call it, they are able to spend $370 billion with confidence. What we've done is turn our back on our own natural resources, our own ability to sustain our energy needs from fossil fuels, and champion this move towards renewables, as Robert says, without any joined-up thinking. I mean, why haven't we done nuclear already? What we've done is economic emasculation in the pursuit of a political ideology, and the science is not settled on it. The science is far from settled on it, and I can tell you I've been watching my weather app very closely over the last month or two to see what's going on.
Obviously,
clearly, obviously. And England is a light in red on Sky News weather, BBC weather, and actually it's been freezing in England. There is a political move here, and unless we're prepared to face up to it.
In June it was not freezing in England. July has been a bit
well, I was reaching for my coat in the mornings in June, taking my coat to the office and then discarding it by the evening.
Amy, do you think this is a bit of a generational thing, where an older generation takes a very different view to the younger generation?
Yes, like when I sit with my family around the dinner table, all my aunties and uncles and my parents and stuff are like, climate change is a myth. Like, my granddad is convinced, if you look back, we've had ice ages before. And I'm like, Grandad, doesn't mean that my little boy Stanley should have to live in an ice age, But I think younger people maybe are sort of more alert to it and want to try and do more.
I do think, Ian, I think this again is one of the problems of the way the political debate is being conducted these days. Is it's a debate of extremes, that either net zero is absolute pernicious nonsense or it's an absolute faith that you have to believe in and sign up to everything. The truth is, this is a problem. We are going to have to face it. Every advanced global economy is going to be forced to change onto a clean energy programme sooner or later.
Well, on the two extremes, I think you're right. There is a sort of almost pseudo-religious zealotry about the extremes of the argument.
And the fact is, there's a problem. It's not going away. It is going to get worse. All advanced economies are going to have to address it. And the sensible debate is, what is the best way to do this? How do we manage it? How do we do what we can, just not only for our country, but for the rest of the world? And I think if we could get past this, yabooery, I'm sorry, I know I sound terribly Liberal Democrat in saying this, but the truth is, if we could just get a little bit past it and have sensible debates about how you achieve the goals that most people believe need to be achieved, everything would be a hell of a lot better.
I do try to have sensible debates on this programme, including this one. Tony in Pitsea has got a nomination for our text question at the end. What is Australia famous for inventing? His answer is the rotary washing line. I'm sure there must be something else, but you never know. Keep your calls coming. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 8:32 and Charlotte Morgan has the news headlines.
After 5 months of industrial action, teaching strikes in England have been brought to an end with a 6.5% pay rise. All 4 unions had been in a long-running row with the government over pay. We're told a British pensioner released from prison in Cyprus will now spend more time there visiting his wife's grave. David Hunter has served time for her manslaughter and maintains she begged him to end her life because of her poor health. And climate change activists say the government's plan for new oil and gas projects in the North Sea will do nothing to reduce reliance on international markets. The Prime Minister insists they are entirely consistent with net zero commitments. LBC weather, light rain continuing for much of the country overnight with a low of 8.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
It's 8:35 here on LBC. Heidi Alexander is with us, Labour candidate for Swindon South. Ben Habib, Reform UK candidate for we know not where yet, but somewhere in the country. Amy Hart is a future candidate, possibly. She is. I hate this word influencer. It's a sort of new thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's a lot.
Do you like describing yourself as that?
I do and I don't, because I use my platform for good, but some people don't.
We all love.
There's a lot of stigma around influencer, but I have to. You are what you are, you know what I mean?
Robert Shrimsley is also an influencer, but of a different kind, because he's chief political commentator for the Financial Times. Right, let's go to another question. It's a text question from Jonathan in Barnstable. If teachers can be grown up enough to accept a pay offer, why are trained staff still behaving like children? Just a bit of background to this. Teacher strikes over pay have ended in England after all 4 unions in a dispute with the government accepted a 6.5% pay rise. The train strikes are still going on, as we all know, although part of the RMT have accepted, I think, a 6% offer. Heidi, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, look, I think we're all relieved, aren't we, to see that an agreement has been reached with the teaching unions and that children's education isn't going to be disrupted in the autumn. I think there'll be a lot of relieved parents, head teachers and teachers about that. With respect to the railways, I think it's complicated and long-running. I mean, Mark Harper, the new Transport Secretary, hasn't got round the table with the unions to sort this out. He seems to be... doing some things that are a bit like waving a red rag in front of a bull at the moment with respect to the proposal to close all the ticket offices on the railways as well. I mean, there's got to be compromise on both sides here. There's going to have to be compromise from the government, and there will have to be compromise from the RMT and ASLEF as well. I rely upon Great Western Railways at the moment. I live in Swindon. I have to come up to London for work. And, I know how important that railway service is for people. And my fear is that people are starting to think they're baking it in to their lives now, that the railways aren't going to be running. And so going back to that change we were having previously, what do we want to be doing if we need to tackle climate change? We need to have excellent public service, public transport services available across the whole of the country. And, in the long-term interests of the railways and encouraging people onto public transport, we've got to find a resolution to this very, very soon.
Should any of you be in Edinburgh on Saturday, you can come and see me interview Mick Lynch at my Fringe event, Iain Dale All Talk. But just after I've interviewed Jeremy Corbyn and Len McCluskey, it's my sort of lefty day at the Edinburgh Fringe. If you want tickets, go to www.forthemany.live.
You're going by train or flying?
I am going by train. Because the first few years I went to Edinburgh, I always flew from Norwich, believe it or not. But I have gone by train certainly last year. Very pleasant it is too. Ben?
Well, there's a risk Heidi and I might agree on something here.
Because, my God.
Oh, my goodness.
I think the public sector has been prevailed upon for the last 15 years. We've had, even before this current spike in inflation, we've had inflation of about 25% in aggregate, before this current, last year's spike as a result of energy costs going up and so on. And real wage growth was about 5%. So they had already experienced a 20% reduction in wages. Now we've got another 10, 11, 15%, depending on how you measure inflation, increase in prices, and we're giving them 6 to 7% wage increase. And at the same time, tax thresholds are being frozen. More and more people are being dragged into the tax net. The median wage in this country is £30,000 a year. So that £12,500 threshold, which is tax-free, is not really helping you much if you're on the median wage. And we've got a problem with our whole economic model, and the public sector is broken. We need to fix it somehow. We've got 5.9 million people on universal credit. That's twice what it was before we went into lockdowns. We've got to get people back into work. We've got to pay them more. We've got to tax them less. We've got to get the public services working again. And so I've got some sympathy with those who wish to go on striking. But as Heidi makes the very good point that, I think the consumer is getting used to it and they're finding ways around it and it's being less effective. And so what we're going to have is embedded sort of ongoing strikes. And of course that too then plays against the economy. You get entrenched inflation and so on. The spiral gets worse and worse.
Amy?
I don't think they're acting like children at all. I think that people that go on strike are really brave, controversially. I think to believe in something so much that you're willing to really fight for it and go against, you might have the media against you and your friends and family might be against you, and with the rails, like some of the general public are against you, but you still believe in it that much.
Do you think consultants are brave for going on strike when they're already earning £127,000 a year on average, that they have pension entitlements which the rest of us can only dream of? Do you think they're brave?
But they're doing it about patient care.
No, they're doing it about pay.
Oh, then I wouldn't agree with that strike, but I do agree with the rail strike, I do agree with the teacher strike. I think, when I worked at British Airways, the other fleet went on strike. We weren't allowed to join in because it was different unions. And a girl that I knew, I messaged her and said, how's things? How are you finding striking? And she's like, I'm trying to find somewhere else to live because my parents are so anti-strike. They've said if I continue to strike, I need to move out. But she was willing to fight for it enough that she was willing to move out.
Wow, families, eh? Robert?
Well, I'm afraid we're in danger of agreeing on this panel. It's absolutely hopeless. I think
we need a new question.
I think the point about the strikes being priced in is a really important one, because I can remember when a rail strike brought the country to a halt, and it was a really big deal. I remember having, walking to work from miles away to get in. And, the rail unions enjoyed this extraordinary power, one of the few unions that really still did have the power to have an immediate impact and bring politicians to the table. And what's very clear is that people, partly because of the working from home issue as well, but people are just getting used to it. They're adapting to it. They're saying, oh, God, there's a rail strike. How am I going to do it this way? And I do think it's a problem for the government. It's a problem for the economy, and it's weakened the rail unions themselves. So I do think they have...
So why haven't they been forced to cave in?
Because they think they're still in with a shot. That's the simple answer. They think they can still... They've done fairly well in getting what they want, and they think they can go further. And furthermore, the rail industry is an industry that's going to go through some fairly aggressive modernisation, and that's going to affect jobs, and they think if they give ground now, that they may not get it back in some of the other issues.
But they don't get paid when they're on strike. So there comes a point where you've put in say a 10% pay claim, and you've gone on strike for so many days that even if you get the 10%, you're still losing money.
Sure, but I mean, that's striking. That's the trade-off. That's one of the reasons why strikes now, instead of being great blocks of you're all out until you're back in again, or a few days here, you go back to work, you get some more money, you go back on strike. That's one of the reasons for that.
Right, we've got a very difficult question coming up next. I'm going to go slightly early to a break so we have a long time to talk about it. It's 8:43.
LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC. 8:45 on LBC. Our next question is a text question from Siobhan in Preston. She asks, will the case of the husband in Cyprus change the conversation on assisted dying over here? And this is the case of David Hunter, who was convicted of the manslaughter of his wife Janice, who was 74, in an assisted suicide at their home in Paphos in 2021. He was jailed for 2 years. He told the trial his wife had cried and begged him to end her life as she suffered from blood cancer. It's an interesting, for anybody who watches Coronation Street, there's a plot on this whole issue in Coronation Street at the moment. It must be incredibly difficult to handle in a drama. Robert, let's go to you first.
I mean, I think it's an absolutely awful case. It's got some individual complexities. It's not quite as clear-cut as some other ones, but it's an awful story. And it goes to the broader point of a failure in the law and something that politicians have been afraid to tackle. I mean, you look at the rules around death, and the only person that doesn't have a say in how they die is the person doing the dying. Everybody else has a view. Governments have a view. Religious organisations have a view. Doctors have a view. They frequently encourage you to put someone who's dying onto... I remember when my mother-in-law had the Liverpool care pathway. It's been superseded, but the idea is, you effectively you would withhold liquid and food. And the truth is, we're not very good at providing end-of-life care. Hospice care, where it's available, is great, but there's not enough of it, and it's not high enough quality. And people are not given this choice, which I think, and the public is way ahead of politicians on this, in thinking that this is something we have to look at, and you have to build safeguards in, and regrettably those safeguards probably mean it's got to be only people with terminal illnesses who get this option, rather than people who have terrible diseases, because you've got to protect those people, and you don't want, the right to die becoming a duty to die, as I think someone said. But I was very struck by Jersey held citizen juries on this recently, and they first of all they enabled citizens to look at this, and first of all they reached an in-principle conclusion that they supported the principle of assisted dying, and then they looked at the methods and the rules and the safeguards they would add, and the support for it actually increased when they did this. And I think we've been a bit gutless on this in addressing it, and we do need to. And there are safeguards that have to be dealt with, but I think the debate is overwhelmingly led by faith organisations who are opposed to it. And my feeling on that is, well, you're entitled to take your position on the basis of your faith. I don't think you're entitled to take my position on the basis of your faith.
Yeah, it's a bit... Maybe I hope this isn't a trite thing to say. Corey's now looking at me thinking it inevitably will be. But I always remember when the whole equal marriage debate was going on, I said, well, if you've got a problem with gay marriage, don't marry homosexual. It's the same here, isn't it? If you've got a problem with assisted dying, there's no obligation on you to take part in it. I
mean, that's right. I mean, look, the point is there are issues that have to be addressed around it. One of them, as I said, is that people feel they might be pressured to agree to assisted dying because they're becoming a burden on their family, which is why, as I said, I think it would have to be accompanied by a certified proof of a terminal illness. Some doctors wouldn't want to be involved in it, and they'd have to have the right not to do so, much as doctors are allowed not to be involved in abortion. But I do think we have reached a point where society is mature enough, and as I said, all opinion polls show the public running way ahead of political debate on this, and clearly in favour of it if done right.
Ben Habib.
Well, I think if I may make a general point about Robert, which he's done really well this evening, which is to illustrate that these debates are not binary on the whole. They tend to be of a pendulum nature, and, where it is that you see the pendulum correctly coming to rest. And this is a particularly emotive case, emotive subject. And the case is a peculiar one. I don't want to go into the details of it, and I'm not sure that any of us will be well qualified enough or knowledgeable enough to, opine on it. But he did asphyxiate his wife to death, which is perhaps one of the most painful ways, no doubt other ways that you can think of that are more painful, but this is, out there in terms of pain. And so I think it comes back to the protection of the... My problem with it is not a religious one. My concern about it is the person concerned being effectively put to death, ultimately without a genuine say in how, whether or not they wish to die.
But if they have a living will, they can have that say.
But people can sign things one day, not feel it the next. If they're not completely mentally there, if they're not even completely physically there, they may not be in a position
to make sure that that would be.
But how much of this how much of this responsibility can you genuinely abrogate to a third party to decide on your behalf, even if at some point in the past you've said this is what you would wish to have? I think it's a very tricky area.
Well, I think we can all agree on that. But there are countries, or certainly one or two states in America, that have gone down this road.
A lot of countries.
And I think can't now think of its name. The one below Oregon. Oregon. They've done it, and I don't think, from what I've read, there have been too many. I mean, I think there's always going to be the odd case that comes up where you think, I'm not sure about that one. But by and large, I think it has.
I like Robert's idea of a terminally ill. Having to be terminally ill. That's, that at least gives it an underlying foundation which is, rock solid.
Amy?
I'm really split on the decision because, like you say, you can make a decision one day. Like, there's certain situations where I'd sit here now and say, oh, no, I'd rather be dead. I'd rather be dead than that happened to me. Like, that happens to me, turn the machine off. But then life is so precious that when you got to that point, might you be, oh, actually... No, don't do it. I watched the Prue Leith and Danny Kruger documentary a little while ago, which is really good. If you haven't watched it, go and watch it. And it really upset me because they basically went around America, and in America you have to go repeatedly to a doctor and be sort of assessed. And there was my granny had Parkinson's for 19 years, and she was in a nursing home for the last 7 years. She probably didn't get out of bed for the last 4 years. And there was a guy with Parkinson's who went to one of these doctors, and they sort of followed his journey, and he was probably 2 or 3 years into what was her 19 years. And I suddenly thought, oh, did we put her through lots of unnecessary pain? But then at the same time, I was absolutely devastated when she died, even though she didn't really know that we were there. So I wouldn't have wanted to help her if she wanted to. I don't think I would have been able to help her from a selfish point of view.
I do think there are 2 points that are worth adding. One is that where this has been implemented in many places, it does require a sustained request.
Yeah, they have to keep going back.
You have to keep asking, so it's not just a one-off moment.
Yeah.
The second thing is, the other thing to factor in are these terribly tragic cases of people, for example, going to Dignitas in Switzerland and actually cutting short their life, dying earlier than they need to because they need to be of a certain ability to go to Switzerland and express their will. So they don't get the chance to squeeze every last moment of their life out before they give up.
Yeah.
And so actually people are dying earlier because of their fear. I mean, I think it's 200 to 300 people kill themselves every year with terminal illnesses because they don't want to go through the final stages.
I was reading about Evan Davis's dad the other day. There was an article that came out, and he killed himself on Evan's wedding day. Is it Evan Davis?
Yes.
Yeah.
And he had written the note saying, I haven't been pressured into this. I did this of all my own accord.
Yeah, so
Heidi.
I would be in favour of changing the law on this. And when I was previously a Member of Parliament, I was chair of the all-party parliamentary group on choice at the end of life. And I do think this is about dignity. It's about the relief of human suffering. And I think that where it's been introduced in other places, and I think we would have to have some very tight criteria on it. I do think it should only apply to people who have a terminal illness, that have a prognosis of less than 6 months to live, that they're mentally competent to take that decision, and that you should have 2 doctors and a judge sign that off. But I agree with the point that Robert was making, that if you had a properly regulated system, this might actually lengthen life as opposed to hasten death. And I remember listening to one of my parliamentary colleagues, Paul Blomfield, who's the MP in Sheffield, talk about his family finding his dad in a car where he had suffocated himself because he had a terminal diagnosis of cancer. And Paul's point was, I would have liked for me and my family to be there when my dad died, as opposed to him being alone in a garage. And I think it was one of the most powerful speeches I ever heard in Parliament. And I do think I think parliamentarians have ducked this issue over the
Charlie
last
Faulkner,
few
Lord
years.
Faulkner, he brought in a bill, was it last year or the year before? And I think that's going to come back. But it's interesting that it's coming from the House of Lords rather than the government or the House of Commons. I'm sure we'll come back to that on a future occasion. Siobhan in Preston. Oh, no, we've just done that one. Brendan in Worcester says, the refugee barge is now being delayed because of fire concerns. Should this cruelty really still be going ahead? Now, The Guardian have reported this evening that the Home Office has been forced to delay sending asylum seekers onto the Bibby Stockholm barge in Dorset, which was meant to happen tomorrow because of concerns about fire safety. There have been warnings it could become a floating Grenfell. Ben Habib.
Well, apparently the cladding is obviously not up to standard. But I mean, this whole thing about how we deal with people that have crossed the channel illegally and entered the country, how we house them, how we provide for them, and how we deal with their asylum applications is very quickly becoming dystopic, isn't it? You've got barges, you've got airfields being taken over. There's an outbreak of tuberculosis. We've now got tents. People are likening that to concentration camps. I doubt it very much that it would be anything like a concentration camp, but that's what they're saying. And then on the other side of the debate, rightly, you've got people like me concerned about the cost of it, the encouragement, if you like, of some of the soft treatment that we've given people who've entered the country illegally, the encouragement that gives others to come in. So I think it's a very thorny issue, and the answer, and no one on this panel is going to like what I'm about to say, but the answer is to stop them crossing the channel in the first place.
I think everyone would agree with that.
Well, except that I would stop them right till the last possible moment, which is the entering of them into our territorial waters. I would actually stop them in the channel if they were seeking to enter British waters, and I would require them to turn around and go back to France, which, by the way, is our international right under the UN Convention of Law of the Sea, and I think it's our government's obligation to protect our borders, which it clearly isn't doing at the moment.
Robert?
Well, I don't think we should burn people. So if the barge isn't safe, then clearly that's a good reason not to use it.
It has been used before.
Yeah, but I mean, if there's an issue with fire safety, that seems reasonable to me. To address it before you
these lefty lawyers
before you put people on it. Well, these lefty lawyers who are against burning people. I don't know. Maybe I'd have to put myself in that category if that's the definition. Look, it's far too late in the evening to get into the argument about what we're going to do with them.
Heidi.
Immigrants.
Well, the government have just got to stop the gimmicks, haven't they? Whether it's barges, Rwanda, tents, they need to crack down on the gangs that are doing the smuggling of people across the country. They need to process the asylum applications. I know they've managed to get it down a little bit, but, a couple of months ago it stood at 166,000 asylum applications that have been hanging around for 6 months or longer, when at the end of the last Labour government it was 6,000. So there's been a massive increase in the number of asylum applications that are waiting to be determined. You've got to have a proper process in place for dealing with those, and then we wouldn't be having these conversations about barges and Rwanda, etc.
Amy?
I don't agree with what you said about our soft treatment of them at all. Don't they get like £30 a week to live on? I read an article about these 3 guys that came over from Afghanistan, and they were coming over to sort of set up a life so they could bring their family over. Obviously, nobody chooses where they're born.
No, but they were in France. They're not coming from Afghanistan. They're actually coming from France.
I know, but I'm quite proud that people want to come and live here. But anyway, and I read this article, and basically they didn't understand that there was charity shops. They were sharing one coat, and they could only go out one at a time because they were sharing a coat. And I just think about, was it in Liverpool that they all were outside the hotel rioting outside the asylum seeker hotel? Like, that for me just breaks my heart, because I think these people, nobody puts their kids in a dinghy on the off chance that, I don't know how to.
But Amy, they're in France. They're safe. They're safe from persecution. They don't have to take that risk. They willfully pay money to take that risk.
Yeah, so crack down on the gangs, like you said. But I think we are an amazing country. We have amazing facilities. And they do want to come here and work. We've got a labour shortage. If they want to work, why don't we let them
There
work?
is a broader point, Ian,
very quickly,
which is that actually goes back to the issue of net zero. We are going to face a global migration crisis. What we're going through now is, again, not that substantial compared to what's coming down the road at us. And countries are going to have to work together on this issue.
Richard says on an Alexa message, can't you talk about more cheerful subjects? Well, it's up to you, Richard. If you want to phone in with a question on a cheerful subject, we'll happily take it. But inevitably, a lot of the subjects in the news are not particularly cheerful. But you'll like this one from from Sam in Cambridge. If you were to recast the hit film Crocodile Dundee with someone from modern British politics or public life playing Mick Dundee rather than Paul Hogan, who would you choose?
Oh, God.
Can I have a quick recap of who Crocodile Dundee is?
I knew you were going to say that.
Yeah.
Young people.
Showing your age there, Amy.
I could have done their neighbours and Home and Away one.
If you've never seen the film...
Is he a crocodile hunter?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think. Heidi?
Well, I'm just thinking about the hair, to be honest. All I can remember about Mick Dundee was he had this sort of shock of blonde hair, didn't he? So, Michael Fabricant?
Very good. Well, I think actually, if I was going to recast it, I'd go for casting against type, and for the sheer joy of it, I have a vision. Jacob Rees-Mogg, crocodile hunter. I'd like to see him in the bush with his double-breasted suits going after the crocs. I think that will be a joy to watch.
Which shows why you're not a casting director. Ben Habib.
Missing out on
I'm never good at these things. Lee Anderson. I mean, he kind of fits the mould, doesn't he?
No,
you can just about see him killing a crocodile, can't you?
And given that you don't know, Amy, the film or anything about it, or Paul Hogan...
I was going to say, I like people to be trained for the job they're going to do. So Matt Hancock's been in the jungle.
Oh dear.
So he
Good
could do it.
answer. Good answer.
Well, he's got nothing better to do at the moment, has he? Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Heidi Alexander, Ben Habib, Amy Hart and Robert Shrimsley. Don't forget cross-question. Someone's just texted to suggest Mick Lynch as the new Paul Hogan. Now, coming up in a moment, we're going to have... I mean, Richard, you're not going to like this subject, I'm afraid, because we're going to talk about the fact that a lot of families are caring for people with dementia in the UK, and a charity has said that